Does a transit agency need to own the buses? Well, that's a question I asked today. And Bern, you have some interesting models. You have an interesting middleware that allows sort of the decoupling. Why don't you tell us about that?
I want to say, first of all, that right now, transit needs to own buses and trains and subways and so on. In the future, with digitization of mobility, whether it's mobility as a service or pretty soon automated vehicles and so on, and already ride-hailing, cities don't need, especially cities that have very thin bus routes, for example, they don't have the sufficient density to support transit, owning transit vehicles. We can move toward an era of, instead of acquiring and operating vehicles, we can move toward an area where transportation authorities specify what they want to happen. They may specify, drop-offs at transit stations, train stations. They may specify rides for disabled riders. They may specify rides for seniors. They may specify rides from transit deserts into the city. We've done that once already up in a city near Toronto, Ontario. It's a small city called Innisfil. It's actually a town called Innisfil. And there's about 30,000 people there. It's a small population over a very large area, so there's no possibility of running a bus system that would be sensible in terms of per ridership costs. So what happens there is the city took their transit budget. They have a budget for moving people into town, into the library, into the city center, and churches and shopping and so on. And they use that budget to subsidize Uber. So the idea is, instead of an Uber costing, let's just say a $12 or $15 ride, maybe it costs $4 or $5. So it's affordable for people that would otherwise use the bus if there was a bus system. But it's perfectly distributed. If they put in a bus system, they would service maybe 20% of the population at great expense per ride, and now they can service the entire population, or the entire distribution of population that don't own their own vehicles. And so it's cheaper per ride. And it distributes the good. I mean, transit has the good of making a ride available to someone that maybe doesn't have a license or can't afford a car and that sort of thing. So that way of providing transit, they're still providing transit, still providing transportation. That's what's important. If you think that transit equals city bus, it doesn't. Transit equals social equity, job access, access to goods, access to a medical appointment, access to getting to a pharmacy for your prescription and so on. So transit's about people getting to what they need to get to. It's not about a bus. So you can provide transit without owning and operating buses in places where that's appropriate. Now, it's not appropriate everywhere.
I would imagine, though, even an agency with a lot of buses, they could focus their buses on high routes and then maybe supplement with what you're talking about.
So until now, or until very recently, the issue about transit is, how do you balance ridership? Because you want to put a lot of people on your bus. Those things are expensive, but with coverage, because you want to reach everybody. So if you want to reach everybody, then you're not going to get ridership in a lot of places. If you want to have high ridership, you're going to be so the balance between coverage and ridership is over with, because you can use these ride-hailing services, for example, and in the future, robo-taxis, to give you the coverage that you want for your entire population, no matter how thinly distributed they are. But you can still keep your heavy ridership. If you're a large city that has light rail or bus rapid transit or subways, you want to bring ridership into those existing heavy systems, but lighten up your bus routes out on the periphery. Use that savings to bolster your core system. So basically, you're able to turn all of transit into like a thin, small vehicle reach that you don't have to own those vehicles. I mean, why does the taxpayer have to own everything? Why can't some of that risk be shed on to some of the commercial operators that change more quickly? They're more flexible. They still need to be regulated. I'm not asking for no regulation, but I'm saying let's own less equipment. Let's have the taxpayers own less things.
And it makes, you've kind of alluded to this, but it makes the transit system so much more responsive, I would think.
It does in that case. So, as an example, paratransit in many cities, you have to order ahead 24 or 48 hours. Well, you need to get to a doctor's appointment and you forgot. That's really inconvenient. Or for some reason,
$61 we heard on average the cost, right?
There was in one city. It was that. I've heard of $30 rides. I've heard of $60 rides. if I'm not talking about the severely disabled. If you're in a wheelchair, that's a separate problem. But if you're an older person that's lost their license, or you're on a cane, I mean, you can still get around. You can get from your home to the curb. You can get into a taxi. You're not badly disabled. So if that's the case, why not get a ride that, maybe it's an $18 ride that you can only afford $4 for, and then the government pays, 12 or 14 for that. That's still way cheaper than 30 or 60, first of all, and it might get to you in 10 or 15 minutes. Why do you need to wait 24 hours for a medical appointment or for, whatever? Even if you're a person that's going to visit your grandchildren, for example, and you can no longer drive. Why do you have to order that on Thursday in order for you to go to Saturday? I mean, it's really an inconvenience. If you lose your license or can't drive, it's hugely inconvenient, and then you get to be punished twice for that. Why?
It seems like the key to all this are software and these things that we have in our hand here, right?
Well, the key for calling for a ride is a smartphone. One of the things that we do is that we have a software platform that arranges for the subsidies for the programs that governments want to regulate. They want to have rides for disabled riders. They want to have rides for senior citizens. They want to have rides from transit deserts. They want to make sure that people have the job reach that they can have, but they can't afford to put a bus out there. Any of those kinds of demands or performance requirements that a transit authority would have, that's posted on a website, and those ride providers, whether there's Uber or Lyft or a taxi company or future, Ford in a couple of years, Ford has a fleet of autonomous vehicles or level 4, geofenced and so on. As all that stuff develops, why not ask those companies or incent those companies to provide the kinds of services that the transit authority understands that its citizens need, right? And maybe some of it has to be subsidized, and there's a lot of ways to do that. I mean, there's people that can afford it, that's okay, but there's people that can't afford it. And they need to be serviced as well without putting out a bus that only has 4 people on it.
And that one example you gave, instead of spending $600,000 a year, the community ended up spending $200,000 for better service.
Yeah, the Nisville, $600,000 to get that up and running. And so for a fraction of that, they decided to divide it up into subsidies for Uber. And of course, soon thereafter, the local taxi company said, well, wait a minute, we can do that too, which is true. I mean, why shouldn't they be able to? And then Lyft has now come to Ontario, and they're about to say, well, we would like to be included as well. So what we do is that platform does is it lets a municipality say what they want, and then that can be chosen from a menu to what services any particular provider wants to provide. So it's kind of a jurisdiction can have multiple performance requirements, and there's multiple providers. One provider wants to provide disability rides, and the other provider wants to just provide transit desert rides. They don't, because they may not be equipped for disability rides. They may not have trained their drive. So not every provider, or not every single provider, does everything, and it leaves the cities much more flexible.
Well, and it gives the consumers choice, and they're end provider. Right?
There's consumer choice, but there's a risk. If you go out and say, okay, we're going to use Lyft, and we're going to contract Lyft to do all of our disability rides, and something happens with Lyft, or any company. I don't mean to pick on that company. It could be Uber. It could be, say, we don't like either, and we're just going to use our local taxi company. Then the local taxi company goes out of business, and so on. You want to make sure that you have the redundancy. It's really about system redundancy, so you're not stuck with somebody changing their prices or somebody not doing so, or somebody can't supply your requirement. Well, you know very well if company A can't supply the requirement, and company B is going to provide it. So you have the supply you want. So we think a lot about transportation demand management. This is transportation supply management.
You're creating an open platform.
And you can't do that with cars. You can't. If you're a jurisdiction, you can't stop people from buying cars. So the supply of personal automobiles is not something that we control, except for in some countries there's outrageous taxes and that sort of thing. But for the most part, I'm from a province that makes cars. My province wants our car makers to make more cars, so they're in conflict, right? I understand that. I mean, there's jobs, there's cars, there's manufacturing, there's economic value. I got that, right? So there's really, how do you balance all of that, give the best services available to your citizens, And the way to do it is right now, today, the way to do it is through ride-hailing companies. How are you going to do it in 3 or 5 or 7 years? You're going to do it through the same companies that are going to be using autonomous vehicles, except there's going to be more of them.
Yeah.
See, Waymo is not operating in Toronto, but it will.
Right.
Ford is not operating in Toronto, it will. GM is not, it will. So what do you do when you have 5 or 6 or 7 providers? You're going to say, well, we just want to work with one of them? I don't think so. You want to put it out and work with all of them.
Yeah, exactly. And,
Right?
then the consumer at the end point has their choice which one they want to choose, right?
Absolutely. So they don't want to say, well, no, I have to use Ford because Ford has the subsidy and GM doesn't.
Right.
But, you know, I prefer Volvo, so I'm going to order that one, and they have the subsidy as well.
Great. Well, Bern, thank you very much for your explanation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good stuff.